Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. The rain hammered against the office windows as Sarah Chun stared at her phone screen, watching the rideshare app cycle through drivers who kept canceling her request. Outside, the Seattle evening had turned into a tempest, and she was trapped on the 15th floor of her husband's law firm, waiting for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing minute. Still here, she turned to find David Matthews, standing in the doorway, his usually pristine suit jacket draped over his arm, tie loosened around his neck. David was one of Mark's partners at the firm, tall, with graying temples that only seemed to add to his distinguished appearance. She'd met him countless times at firm parties, always finding him polite but distant, professional to a fault. "My ride keeps getting cancelled," Sarah said, holding up her phone with a weak smile. "I'm starting to think I might be camping out here tonight." David glanced toward the windows where rain streaked down like tears. "I can give you a ride home. I'm heading that direction anyway." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't the usual cordial offer of a colleague's husband. There was something softer there, almost hesitant. Sarah had always sensed there was more to David than the buttoned-up attorney everyone saw at the office. But she'd never been alone with him long enough to find out. "I don't want to impose," she said, though her heart was already saying yes to more than just the ride. "You're not imposing." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. "Besides, Mark would never forgive me if I left his wife stranded." The mention of her husband's name should have been enough to remind her of all the reasons this was just a practical arrangement. But as she gathered her things and followed David to the elevator, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something that had been building in the quiet spaces between stolen glances and accidental touches at office gatherings. The elevator ride to the parking garage was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery and the distant sound of rain. Sarah found herself studying David's reflection in the polished steel doors, noting how he kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking. When their eyes met in the reflection, neither looked away this time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the ride." "Thank you for accepting," he replied, and something in his tone made her heart skip. The parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty. David's BMW sat alone in the corner, sleek and dark under the fluorescent lights. He opened the passenger door for her, a gesture that seemed both gentlemanly and intimate in the echoing space dot as they pulled out into the storm. Sarah settled into the leather seat and tried to ignore how aware she was of David's presence beside her. The car smelled like his cologne, something woody and warm that she'd noticed during their brief encounters at firm events. Now, enclosed in this small space with him, it seemed to wrap around her like a whispered secret. "Rough day?" he asked, navigating through the rain-slicked streets. "You could say that." Sarah turned to study his profile, noting the way his jaw tensed slightly as he concentrated on driving. "Mark's been working late every night this week. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a ghost." She hadn't meant to say that. The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession she wasn't ready to make. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He's lucky to have you waiting for him." "Am I waiting, though?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Sometimes I think I'm just existing, going through the motions." They stopped at a red light, and David turned to look at her fully. In the glow of the streetlights, his eyes seemed darker, more intense. Sarah. Her name on his lips sounded different than when Mark said it. Less casual, more reverent. Like he was handling something precious. "I shouldn't have said that," she whispered, but she couldn't look away from him. "Maybe you should have." Said it a long time ago. The light turned green, but David didn't move. Cars began honking behind them, but he seemed oblivious to everything except her face. Rain streamed down the windshield, creating a cocoon around them, making the rest of the world feel distant and unreal. "David," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. He reached across the space between them, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. The touch was gentle, questioning, as if he was asking permission for something they both knew would change everything. "I've thought about this moment for 3 years," he said softly. "Every time I see you at those parties, laughing at something Mark said, I wonder what it would be like if you were laughing with me instead." Sarah's breath caught. "You can't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because you're married to my partner. Because it's complicated." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she felt herself leaning into the touch. "Or because you feel it too. And that terrifies you." The honking behind them grew more insistent, but neither moved. This moment felt suspended in time, fragile and perfect and completely impossible. "I do feel it," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "God help me, I do." David's eyes searched her face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Decision being made. A line being crossed. "Then what are we doing, Sarah? What are we really doing here?" Finally, reluctantly, he pulled his hand away and drove forward. But the air in the car had changed, charged with possibilities and unspoken promises. Sarah pressed her hand to her cheek where his touch still lingered, wondering if she'd ever be able to forget the way he'd looked at her in that moment. They drove in silence for several blocks, the tension between them so thick it seemed to fill every corner of the car. Sarah watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood approaching and felt a strange sense of loss, as if she was being pulled away from something she'd been searching for without knowing it. "I should tell you something," David said, as they turned onto her street. "I asked Mark about you once. About your marriage." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What did you say?" "I said I thought you seemed lonely at the firm parties. That maybe he should make more time for you." David's voice was careful, controlled. He laughed it off, said you were fine, that you understood the demands of his career. "He said that. He said you married a lawyer. So you knew what you were getting into." David glanced at her and she saw something like anger flash in his eyes. "Like you were just another asset to be managed." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known Mark was devoted to his work, but she'd never realized how he talked about her when she wasn't there. How he reduced their marriage to a business arrangement, their love to a series of understood terms and conditions. "He's not wrong," she said quietly. "I did know what I was getting into. But did you know what you were giving up?" The question hung between them as David pulled into her driveway. The house was dark. Mark was still at the office as usual. For a moment, they sat in the car, engine running, neither making a move to end this strange, charged evening. "I should go," Sarah said, but she didn't move. "You should," David agreed, but he didn't unlock the doors. Instead, he turned off the engine, and suddenly the sound of rain on the roof seemed deafening. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as David turned to face her fully. "I want to tell you something else," he said, his voice low and rough. "Every time I've seen you over the past 3 years, I've gone home and thought about what it would be like to be the man who gets to hold you at night. To be the one you turn to when you're sad or scared, or just need someone to see you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "David, please don't. I know it's not fair. I know you're married to my partner, my friend. But I also know that life is short. And chances like this don't come often." He leaned closer, and she could see the rain droplets on his hair, the way his eyes seemed to hold entire conversations. "I'm not asking you to leave him. I'm not asking you to blow up your life. I'm just asking you to consider that, maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be someone's first choice instead of their afterthought. The words broke something open inside her, and Sarah felt tears spill over. I can't think about this. I can't. Then don't think, David said gently. Just feel. For once, just let yourself feel what you want, instead of what you think you should want. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, and the simple contact sent electricity up her arm. They sat like that for a long moment, holding hands in the darkness of his car, both of them breathing hard like they'd just run a marathon. If I kiss you right now, David said softly, everything changes. Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the wedding ring that suddenly felt like a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. Maybe everything needs to change. When she looked up at him, she saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, David leaned forward. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed as his lips brushed against hers, soft, tentative, like he was savoring a dream he'd been afraid to have. The kiss deepened, and Sarah felt herself melting into him, her free hand finding its way to his chest. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, fast and strong, matching her own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Sarah, David whispered against her lips. I know, she whispered back. I know. They sat there, foreheads touching, sharing the same breath, the same impossible moment. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. But inside the car, Sarah felt like she was in the eye of a hurricane that was about to tear her carefully constructed life apart. I should go inside, she said, though every part of her wanted to stay. Right here, in this bubble of possibility and desire. You should, David agreed, but he kissed her again, soft and lingering, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her. When they finally separated, Sarah's lips felt swollen. Her heart was racing, and she knew she'd never be the same. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands and opened the car door, but before she could step out, David caught her wrist. Sarah, he said, his voice urgent. This isn't over. This can't be over. She looked back at him, seeing the need in his eyes, the same desperate longing that was clawing at her chest. I don't know what this is, David. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I, he admitted. But I know I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't go back to polite small talk at firm parties and pretending I don't think about you every day. Sarah felt tears threatening again. My marriage. Your marriage is what it is, David said gently. But you're more than just Mark's wife. You're Sarah. You're brilliant and funny and beautiful, and you deserve to be with someone who sees all of that. Someone who chooses you every day, not just when it's convenient. The words hit her like a revelation. When was the last time Mark had chosen her? When was the last time he'd cancelled a meeting to be with her, or surprised her with something that showed he was thinking about her when they were apart? I need time, she said finally. I need to think. Take all the time you need, David said, though his eyes were pleading. But don't disappear on me, Sarah. Don't pretend this was just a moment of weakness brought on by a rainstorm. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped out of the car. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and she stood in her driveway, watching David's taillights disappear into the night. Only then did she allow herself to touch her lips, to remember the way he'd kissed her like she was precious, like she was chosen. Inside the house, Sarah moved through her evening routine like a sleepwalker. She showered, washing away the scent of David's cologne, but she couldn't wash away the memory of his touch. She changed into pajamas and sat on her bed, staring at her phone. Mark had sent a text. Working late again, Don't wait up. The message felt like a symbol of everything wrong with her life. 5 words, sent without thought, dismissing her as casually as he might dismiss a client's minor concern. She found herself comparing it to the way David had looked at her, like she was the most important thing in his world. Sarah walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the street where David's car had been parked. The rain had stopped completely now, and the moon was peeking through the clouds. She pressed her hand to the glass and wondered if she was strong enough to keep living this half-life, married to a man who saw her as an afterthought. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I can't stop thinking about you. Sweet dreams, Sarah. She stared at the message for a long time, her heart racing. David had somehow gotten her number, probably from the firm directory. And now he was reaching across the distance between them, refusing to let her forget what had happened in his car. She should delete the message. She should block his number. She should march into Mark's office tomorrow and confess everything, beg for forgiveness, recommit to her marriage. Instead, she saved his number in her contacts and typed back, I can't stop thinking about you either. The response came immediately. Have coffee with me tomorrow. Just coffee. Just 2 people talking. Sarah stared at the message, her finger hovering over the keyboard. She thought about Mark working late again, probably not even thinking about her. She thought about David's hands on her face, the way he'd said her name like it was sacred. Where and when? She typed. The next morning, Sarah sat in a small cafe across town, somewhere she'd never been before, somewhere she wouldn't run into anyone from Mark's firm. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of the previous evening, every word David had spoken, every touch they'd shared. When he walked in, her breath caught. In the morning light, he looked different, younger somehow, less polished. He wore jeans and a simple sweater, and his hair was slightly mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it. When he spotted her, his face lit up with a smile that made her stomach flip. You came, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. I almost didn't, she admitted. What changed your mind? Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, needing something to hold on to. I realized I haven't felt this alive in years. Not since before I married Mark. Maybe not ever. David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Tell me about before. Tell me about the woman you were before you became Mrs. Mark Chan. The question surprised her. No one had asked her that in so long. She'd almost forgotten there had been a before. I was different. I painted. I traveled. I took risks. What happened to her? She got married to a man who needed a wife who would fit into his world, who would be presentable at firm parties and wouldn't ask for too much attention. Sarah's voice caught. I didn't realize I was auditioning for a role. I thought I was falling in love. David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Maybe you were falling in love. Maybe you both were. But people change, Sarah. Sometimes they grow apart. Sometimes they realize they want different things. What do you want? She asked, turning her hand palm up so their fingers could intertwine. I want to know you, David said simply. The real you. The woman who painted and traveled and took risks. I want to be the person who helps you remember who you were before you started living your life for someone else. The words hit her like a physical blow, but in the best way possible. That's dangerous territory, David. The best things usually are. They talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. David told her about his own marriage, which had ended 5 years ago when his wife realized she was more in love with the idea of being married to a successful lawyer than with David himself. Sarah told him about her art, about the paintings. She'd stopped creating when Mark complained they cluttered up the house. Do you still paint? David asked. Sometimes. In secret. I have a small studio in the basement that Mark doesn't know about. Show me, David said immediately. I want to see your work. Sarah's heart raced. I can't take you to my house. Mark, then show me somewhere else. Rent a studio. Paint something new. David's eyes were bright with possibility. Paint something that shows me who you really are. The suggestion was crazy, impossible, wonderful. Sarah felt something unfurling in her chest. Something she thought was dead. I couldn't. The expense. I'll pay for it, David said. Consider it an investment in getting to know the real Sarah Chan. I can't let you do that. Then don't let me. Ask me to. Ask me to help you find yourself again. Sarah stared at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine desire to understand her. When was the last time someone had asked her what she wanted? When was the last time someone had been willing to invest in her dreams instead of just tolerating them? Okay, she whispered. Okay? Help me find myself again. David's smile was like sunrise. When can we start? They made plans to meet the next day to look at studio spaces. As they prepared to leave the cafe, David caught her hand. Sarah, he said, his voice serious. I need you to know something. This isn't just about the attraction between us. This isn't just about wanting what I can't have. I see something in you that I don't think you even see in yourself anymore. Someone worth fighting for. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. What if I'm not? What if I'm just a bored housewife having a midlife crisis? Then you're the most magnificent midlife crisis I've ever seen, David said, and kissed her hand softly. But you're not. You're a woman who's been sleeping, and it's time to wake up. That evening, Sarah stood in her basement studio, looking at the canvases she'd hidden from Mark. Most were unfinished, abandoned when she'd lost confidence, or when Mark had made some comment about her hobby. But now, with David's words echoing, in her mind, she saw them with new eyes. They weren't failures, they were beginnings. She picked up a brush for the first time in months and began to paint. Colors flowed across the canvas, blues and purples and golds that seemed to glow with their own light. She painted until her back ached, until her hands were stained with pigment, until she felt like herself again. When Mark came home at midnight, he found her in the kitchen, washing paint from her hands. What's all over your hands? He asked, loosening his tie. Paint, Sarah said simply. I thought you gave up that hobby. I did, but I'm starting again. Mark frowned. Sarah, you know how I feel about that. It's messy, and we don't have room for all those supplies. Can't you find something else to do with your time? Looking at her husband, Sarah felt something shift inside her. 6 months ago, she would have apologized, would have promised to clean up better, would have slowly let her painting fade away again. But now, with David's words fresh in her mind, she saw the conversation differently. No, she said quietly. I can't. What do you mean you can't? I mean, I'm not giving up painting again. I'm good at it, Mark. It makes me happy. And I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. Mark stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Sarah, what's gotten into you? I'm remembering who I am, she said. Who I was before I became someone else's idea of who I should be. I don't understand what you're talking about. I know, Sarah said sadly. That's the problem. She left him standing in the kitchen and went upstairs to bed. But she didn't sleep. Instead, she lay in the darkness, thinking about David's hands on her face, about the way he'd looked at her paintings like they were treasures, about the possibility of a life where she was seen and valued for who she really was. The next morning, she met David at the first studio space. It was small but bright, with north-facing windows that would provide perfect light for painting. Sarah walked around the empty room, imagining easels and canvases, imagining herself creating without having to hide. "What do you think?" David asked, watching her face. "It's perfect," she breathed. "Then it's yours." Sarah turned to him, overwhelmed by his generosity, by the way he seemed to understand what she needed before she even knew it herself. "David, I can't." "You can," he said, stepping closer. "You can have this. You can have anything you want, Sarah. You just have to be brave enough to reach for it." Standing in that empty studio, with David looking at her like she was the most important thing in the world, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not just for her art, but for herself. For the possibility of a life where she was more than just someone's wife. Where she was valued for who she was, rather than how well she fit into someone else's plans. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you paint," David said simply. "And I get to watch you become yourself again." But even as he said it, Sarah saw the deeper question in his eyes, the one neither of them was ready to voice. What happens when becoming herself means choosing between the life she's built and the life she's always dreamed of? As they signed the lease on the studio space, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up." She showed the message to David, who read it with a deepening frown. "He doesn't even ask how you are," David sighed quietly. "Doesn't ask about your day or if you need anything. He's busy," Sarah said automatically, then stopped. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm defending him." "Because you're loyal," David said. "Because you love him, even if he doesn't love you the way you deserve to be loved." The words hung between them, heavy with truth and possibility. Sarah knew she was standing at a crossroads, that the choices she made in the next few days would determine the shape of her entire future. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of wanting too much. Of asking for more than I deserve." David stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "What if I told you that you deserve everything? Every kindness, every consideration, every moment of happiness you can grab?" "Then I'd say you barely know me." "I know enough," David said, his hand finding hers. "I know you're brave enough to take a ride from a man who's been half in love with you for 3 years. I know you're strong enough to start painting again, even when your husband doesn't support it. I know you're beautiful enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about what I wanted from life." Sarah's breath caught. "David, I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's complicated and messy, and probably the worst timing in the world, but I'm in love with you, Sarah. And I think, maybe, you might be falling in love with me too." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Because he was right. Somewhere between the rain-soaked car ride and the morning coffee, and the empty studio filled with possibilities, she had fallen in love with David Matthews. Not just with the idea of him, but with the man who saw her as she really was and loved her for it. "I am," she whispered. "God help me, I am." David's face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Then what are we going to do about it?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and fear, and the weight of all the lives that would be changed by whatever they decided. Sarah looked around the empty studio, at the space where she would create art again, where she would remember who she was before she became someone else's idea of who she should be. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I know I can't go back to pretending I don't feel this. I can't go back to sleepwalking through my life." "Then don't," David said, and kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Whatever happens, don't go back to sleep." As they stood there, holding each other in the empty studio, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. The courage to want more. To demand more. To believe that she deserved a love that saw her, valued her, chose her every single day. The road ahead was uncertain, complicated, potentially heartbreaking. But for the first time in years, Sarah Chen was awake. And she was ready to fight for the life she'd always dreamed of, even if it meant leaving behind the life she'd built. The story was just beginning, and Sarah was finally ready to write it herself. Outside, the Seattle sky was clearing after yesterday's storm, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of traffic, of life moving forward, of the world turning toward whatever came next. She was ready to turn with it, hand in hand with a man who saw her as she really was, toward a future that was uncertain but utterly, completely alive.